with that, we'll come in. We got 2 more sessions here, or 3 more sessions, but the first one and most important one right now is Mr. Kevin coming up for talk about modifying your sales process for different types of leads.
Thank you, Terry. It's turned on. Good deal. Thank you. All right, well, I see a couple of new faces out there. So again, Kevin Sabourin, Vice President of Sales, Marketopia. I've been with the company now 2 months, and as I said earlier, I'm drinking from a fire hose and loving every minute of learning all about what's happening in this space. So that session in particular was really fascinating for me. I want to tell you about something I read recently about Aristotle. And I know you're probably looking at the agenda and saying, in 15 minutes you're going to bring up a Greek philosopher from 350 BC. And I am, because I think there's some relevance to it, and I want to tell you why really quick. So when I was reading about him, I was fascinated that he has these views of space, and he was one of the early adopters of the world is round concept. And that played really well with folks like Alexander the Great. They really understood a lot about the concept of space and infinity and how small the world is in the big picture and different views and different vantage points. It really opened people's mind to perspective. And I was really curious about that and started reading more about his biography and different things about Aristotle. And I was surprised to learn that he was an early proponent of the continuum, the concept of a continuum, and specifically that on a continuum, there's stages to it. And that was a really distinct and unique part of his philosophy, is that, you know, this movement of left to right, like we would describe maybe our sales pipeline, there's also stages, very defined segments to it. So much like we would say a stage 1, a 2, a 3, an MQL, an SQL, whatever that migration is left to right, there's stages in it. And I reconcile that, like I'm thinking pipeline when I hear that, right? And the third thing was, Aristotle talked about, he was the one who coined the concept of I'm going to tell you, or I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. And I love that because as a communicator, a professional communicator, I love the idea of closing the loop. So big surprise, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you the 2 main things that I want to discuss today. The agenda is going to show 4, and the 2 things that I really want to take away today are the difference between word-of-mouth leads and cold leads, okay? It's some, like, we're going to visit this in 15 minutes. We're going to cover this a few times. The second thing is, I believe all leads have value. Maybe not with the same urgency, but all leads have value, okay? This will set up some things we want to talk about as we close out the day. But those 2 concepts, that word-of-mouth leads are very different than cold leads, and all leads have value, I think are 2 pretty important pieces. So let's talk about, you know, referrals and word of mouth and some of the differences. So like Nielsen talks about here, people are 4 times more likely to buy when referred by friends. So in the 2 months that I've been with Marketopia, I report to Terry. Terry and I started out with a business relationship, and as we've gotten to know each other, we understand more and more about each other's preferences and interests, and, you know, we developed this this friendship and so forth. I happen to know a couple things about Terry, and as does he with me. We both like steak. It came up the other day. We both love barbecuing. And in particular, we like to barbecue with a patty of butter on the steak, right? The way that it sort of caramelizes it and adds a crisp texture to it. And it's just one of these conversations that work and teammates have, right? So if Terry were to say to me tonight, as it's getting closer in the late afternoon, we're starting to think about dinner hour and so forth, hey, Kev, Del Frisco's, which is like across the street, is really great, but Charlie's is even better down the street, right? I have a vetted source, somebody who I now trust and appreciate and respect, who knows my preferences and knows that I'm at a moment of time where I have a decision that I'm going to be making about like what I'm going to eat for dinner, right? Wouldn't that make a ton of sense if I were to walk right past Del Frisco's and move on to Charlie's, because somebody that I know who has an interest in exactly and catches me at the right moment steers me towards something that I know and appreciate, right? It's really no different than another business owner saying to you, you know, you're in a moment of need. Maybe somebody local was hacked, or maybe you had somebody leave the company that was an IT specialist or what have you, and they say, you're in a moment of need and I know who you should talk to. That's kind of a layup, right? And if you think about Aristotle's continuum and those stages, and what Terry and Andra talked about earlier today in advancing the sale, Terry would jump me to the front of the line. Like, Charlie's didn't really have to work very hard for my business. He caught me in a moment at a time where there was a moment in need and I had a preference, and he jumped me to the front of the line, right? They didn't have to work very hard at it. That's okay. They got an easy one. They got a layup. Not everything happens that easy. That's the problem, right? So, you know, to have to work at the lead, to have to spend time investing in it, when you really boil it down, like the two different kinds of leads here, the word of mouth versus the cold leads, I could challenge you for a minute or two to stare at those two things and see if you see differences between the pros and cons for each. They're identical lines, right? It's just that in one instance, you were jumped a little faster, a little further in the line. You got closer to the decision-making moment. And again, if it were easy in all those instances, you know, we'd be advancing people up the line faster. But like they were saying earlier, in the best practices of a sale, it takes time to build trust. That thing that Terry was saying earlier, and Andrew was also commenting on about, you know, look the part, talk the part, understand your content, dress sharp, do your homework, ask questions, and listen. The reason for all those touch points, those phases in that sales continuum, is that the trust is being built during those timelines, right? In those instances. Well, I call them touch points, but each one of those touch points is another opportunity to brand yourself, like Andrew was saying, and to further that relationship with folks. So, but there's a trick to it. There's an efficiency piece to it that I think we can't lose sight of. And it's really critically important that if there's a general flow of the activity from left to right, from the initial conversation to the closing of the deal, we've got to figure out like who we're talking to and who's like occupying our time. Like, think about it like occupying your calendar. You know what I mean? Like, if I only had, whatever, 40 hours in the week and those little squares represent me sacrificing my calendar, I understand the desire to sort of like block people out and, you know, put them aside because it's a little further than I want to go, or it's a little smaller endpoint size than I wanted, or what have you. But it doesn't mean there isn't a place for it. We just really need to incubate those people so they don't hit the calendar immediately. But we want to stay connected with them so that we can continue to move the entire herd through the sales pipeline. I'll show you what I mean by that. My belief is that everybody has a space in the pipeline. They just maybe don't need to occupy my calendar today. Jeff, who's going to speak to us in a minute, is one of the top like producers on the team, right? And he's like in many businesses would be a high value asset that you don't want to burden with, you know, something that's a lower or a further MQL, right? Has less value. So I don't really want Jeff to be tied up with that kind of activity out of the gate all day, every day. But I also need to sort of vet the client and put him in sort of a what I call a bucket, right? And I'll show you what I mean by that. So there's a wide space, before I leave this slide, there's a wide space between cold calls and MQLs. And there's a wide space between setting the first appointment and closing the deal. That pipeline represents that movement from left to right, from it's really incubating a relationship the entire time through that pipe. Is that making sense? Okay. So maybe the goal is to identify which bucket those people go into so that you can take the ones that are closest to selling and incubate the ones that are further away, while honoring that pipeline, that transition from left to right that we were talking about earlier. I kind of liken it to Kentucky Derby, 12 horses all lined up. You hear the fun bugle, gates crash open, they go thundering out, right? At the first furlong, all the horses sort of look alike. That's almost like the intro call, right? Or the first appointment set and the second appointment set. By the time you get to the second furlong, some of the horses are dropping back a little bit, and some are clearly moving out to the front of the lead. This is like 12 leads, or 26 or 40, as some of our partners are talking about. It'd be nice to have 40 every month, right? So it's like they're taking off in the second and the third furlong. You start to see this distancing happening with the horses. It's like the evolution of an individual sale or a prospect or a potential client as they all move through your pipeline simultaneously. The one that looks like it has no chance initially, you still want to have that first call, but as soon as you identify that it's a different kind of a target, you want to put it in a bucket that addresses the speed that horse is going to finish, right? So you're really trying to incubate that lead until they either get to the right size that you need them to be, or they have the urgency, the need, they meet the BANT criteria, right? Whatever criteria that it is that you're deciding how fast you want to move forward with that person, my recommendation is you find a bucket, and my term is bucket. You find a bucket for those people so that you address all of them, you meet their need where it is, you meet their urgency where it is. Remember when somebody said earlier today about your plan for selling somebody and their plan for buying aren't necessarily matching up perfectly at all times? It always defaults to the slowest common denominator, which is going to be probably the clients. So address them professionally, look the part, know the content, meet them where they're at, and move them through that process. And as soon as you identify that they're not ready at this moment, get them in that bucket that nurtures them so that you can continue to manage that relationship. And ultimately, every client wants to feel connected. So we're trying to keep that feeling of connectedness while we nurture every one of those horses that took off out of the gate all at the same time, because they're going to close and they're going to finish at different speeds. So, questions on that? What we talked about, and I told you I would repeat back, is all leads have value, right? All leads have value. The word of mouth leads and the cold leads are going to take different amounts of work. So if you can address the cold leads by putting them in a bucket that meets them where they're at in the moment and allows them to nurture along at a speed that makes sense for both you and the client, you've got a place to put them, a way to nurture them, as I call it, incubate them, so that you can prepare them for a sale as soon as they're ready in the future. So when they're ready for that steak dinner, when it's almost dinner time and they happen to be in Orlando, they follow Terry's advice and they go over to Charlie's. That's really the concept here. I really want you to think hard about those two things, because leads, it takes work to get them, but it's absolutely possible. It's very doable, and that's what we're all trying to do here. So with that, I want to say thanks, and I also want to remind you earlier, as Andrew's been reminding us, please link in with me and stay connected. I'll do the same with you. Follow each other back, and let's build our networks and our personal brand as we navigate through this process. And I want to thank you for your time and attention. And I think I'm handing it to Andrea.